The Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which we know was culminated in August 1939, was the agreement calculated in terms of power politics to fulfill the immediate needs of Nazi Germany on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. For Hitler, Nazi Germany, this pact served to, in a sense, neutralize the Soviets, while Hitler's own armies planned to annihilate Poland. For Stalin, it provided the Soviet Union with a necessary breathing space, if you will, to expand control over a buffer zone along the country's western borders and to reinforce the Soviet Union's military forces for what seemed to be potentially or actually almost an inevitable conflict. And that inevitable conflict, after 2 years of alliance between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, we're now in the spring of 1941. Hitler abandons the facade of cooperation with those hated Bolsheviks, who were always hated. And in May, plans were completed for a military campaign that came to be known as the Operation Barbarossa. The Operation Barbarossa, named after a medieval emperor of the Holy German Empire. And Operation Barbarossa was simply a code name for invasion of the Soviet Union. And on June 22nd, 1941, June 22nd, 1941, Nazi German forces launch an all-out attack on Soviet territory. The plan, that is Operation Barbarossa, quite straightforward, quite straightforward. It had three objectives. It had three objectives, and those objectives were: one, destruction of the Soviet armed forces; two, the capture of the political and industrial centers of Russia, namely Moscow and Leningrad; and three, occupation of Ukraine and also the sub-Caucasus region to the southeast of Ukraine with the incredible mining and agricultural wealth of these territories, in particular eastern Ukraine, central and eastern Ukraine. Now, the technique that was used was the very same technique that Hitler 2 years before had used against Poland. That is a lightning blitzkrieg, a blitzkrieg of combined ground and air attacks along a front running from the Baltic to the Black Sea. So this is an enormous front from here all the way down to the Black Sea. Now, of these three goals that I just mentioned, liquidation of the Soviet armed forces, capture of Leningrad and Moscow, and then taking most of Ukraine, only the third of them was achieved. While the Nazi Germans did come close, neither Leningrad nor Moscow was captured. And when I mean close, they were on the outskirts of Moscow. In fact, the road from the Moscow airport to the center, always still they have this kind of symbol there of how far the Germans got. But Moscow did not fall, nor did Leningrad. And that other goal, the first one, the Soviet forces, while they were largely decimated, they were not destroyed. Now, as for that third goal, which included Ukraine or Ukrainian territories, the front moved rapidly eastward. In fact, there was no front. It was just the Germans moving rapidly eastward, so that by November 1941, this begins in June 22nd, by November, just 4 months after the initial start of the invasion, virtually all of Soviet Ukraine was under German control. Now, in response to this incredibly quick German offensive, Stalin and the Soviet government called on the people of Ukraine, this was in the middle of the summer in July, to defend the fatherland. Now, whether or not they heeded the call, and many remembering forced collectivization, famine, purges of the 1930s, did not heed the call. But all of that seemed irrelevant because the German military advance was very successful and very quick. And so in desperation also that month, in a radio speech in July, Stalin called on the remaining Soviet forces to, quote unquote, make life in the rear of the enemy unbearable. What did that mean in practice? A scorched earth policy which saw the retreating Soviet troops destroy industrial plants, railroads, food supplies, water resources, cultivated fields, and other resources. Most of the mines in the Donbas region in the east were flooded, and even the Dnieper Hydroelectric Works, a pride of the Soviet Union in the late 20s, early 30s, all 54 blast furnaces blown up. This scorched earth policy would have been even more destructive had the Soviets not been forced to retreat so rapidly. As they were retreating, however, as rapid as it was, there was some planned evacuation, and as many as 3.8 million people, as well as 850 large industrial establishments, they actually took down the plants, put them on railroad cars, and shipped them east. All of this was removed from Soviet Ukraine to the eastern part of the Soviet Union. In fact, a town called Ufa in the southern part of the Ural Mountains, this now became the provisional capital of Soviet Ukraine. Now, not all Soviet Ukrainian territory came under German rule. The Romanians, or Romania, an ally initially of Hitler, had joined the German forces in the invasion of the Soviet Union. And already in the summer of 1941, Romania received back not only northern Bukovina and all of Bessarabia, which it had ruled during the interwar years, then lost to Stalin the previous summer, or the Soviet Union in 1940. Now they get it back. So aside from, as we can see on this map, which would be Bukovina here, Bessarabia here, even farther On the other, farther east, they got another chunk of land which Romania had never had, called Transnistria. Transnistria, that is beyond the Dnieper River, of course, from the perspective of Romania. So here's the Dnieper River, and beyond it, in between the Dnieper and the southern Bug, an area called Transnistria. All these areas now were ruled by Romania, and that was to be the situation throughout the war years until the arrival of the Soviet Army, Red Army, in 1944. But the Romanian-controlled lands, Ukrainian inhabited lands, and even the smaller Hungarian-ruled Transcarpathia, which we had spoken about, these, in effect, were the exceptions. The vast majority of Ukrainian territory came under German control, Nazi German control, and that territory, in turn, was divided into three distinct administrative regions. Three distinct administrative regions. If we look on this map, one of those regions was known as the Generalgouvernement, actually formerly Generalgouvernement Polen, using the Germans' strange situation to use this French term Generalgouvernement and then Poland, the German term. Those areas of eastern Poland that had been part of pre-war Poland or interwar Poland. And so the Generalgouvernement was here. Then farther east, most of Ukraine was known as the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. And lastly, beyond, the military zone. The military zone. Now, initially, many people in Ukraine, ethnic Ukrainians among them, welcomed the German invasion. Why? They saw it, or they hoped, that they would be liberated from Soviet control and perhaps obtain a better life for Ukraine as a national entity. But those hopes were in no way fulfilled, though we also need to say that the fate, the status of Ukrainians differed greatly between those two lands, the Generalgouvernement and the Reichskommissariat. First of those, the Generalgouvernement, well, it encompassed, it had already existed when Germany conquered Poland. It was on the western side of the demarcation line between the Soviets and the Germans, but that no longer played. Then we have all the rest of eastern Galicia is added to the Generalgouvernement. They're enthusiastic members of the Bandera faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which we'll be referring to, the OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and one of the two factions was the Bandera faction, and the other the Melnyk faction. This Bandera faction arrived as part of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. They saw themselves as semi-autonomous entities or actors in this thing. And on June 30th, 1941, like a few days after the invasion began, Operation Barbarossa began, this faction in Lviv on June 30th proclaimed the re-establishment or the renewal of the Ukrainian state. Of course, they were acting on their own. What are these people doing from this perspective of Nazi Germany? And the reaction of the Nazi Germany was to arrest all the leaders of the Banderite faction that had made this provocative proclamation from their standpoint, and deported them to Germany, where they remained for the duration of the war. So they sat in German prison camps. Bandera himself, the leader who proclaimed this renewal of the republic or removal of the state, Yaroslav Stetsko. Now, despite this incident, nonetheless, the Germans did allow for the creation of a Ukrainian land committee in Lviv. It was merged with the already existing example of that kind of committee that was in Krakow during those 2 years of German-Soviet accommodation. Under the auspices of this Ukrainian Land Committee, now based in Lviv in eastern Ukraine, part of the Generalgouvernement, several Ukrainian cooperatives that had been dismantled during those 2 years of Soviet regime are then now revived. Elementary, technical, and secondary schools were operated. Ukrainians were also permitted to enter the lower ranks of the civil and judicial administrative apparatus of the Generalgouvernement. And finally, in April 1943, toward the end of the war, was established a volunteer Ukrainian military unit known as the Galicia Division. The Galicia Division, April 1943. Didn't really see action until the end of the year. It was formed and made part of the Waffen-SS of the German military structure. It had a very specific goal to fight against the Soviet army on the Eastern Front. Now, despite all of these developments, it should also be remembered that the Generalgouvernement Poland in general was part of Greater Germany, and so you can see the dark colors. Well, it can't really distinguish it, but here it is. This is part of Greater Germany. What did that mean? Is that it had its own civil administration headed by an appointee made by Hitler, German Governor General, resident in Krakow, named Hans Frank. Hans Frank. As I said, he was appointed and therefore directly responsible and acted on the orders of Hitler. We should note that certainly in comparison with other Ukrainian territories, whether Romanian-occupied Bukovina, Bessarabia, and certainly Transnistria, or even in comparison to Hungarian-occupied Transcarpathia, and certainly in comparison to that second territory, the main one, the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, Eastern Galicia, together also with lands just beyond to the west of the old demarcation line, the Lemko region, Chelm area, Podlachia, all of these now part of the Generalgouvernement, part of Greater Germany, were treated relatively, and I stress relatively, well during the war years, for most of the war years. Now, the situation in that second of three territories that were taken by Nazi Germany, the Reichskommissariat, carved primarily out of former Soviet Ukrainian territory, Soviet Ukraine. There, the situation was quite different. As part of his declaration of war against the Soviet Union, Hitler announced that day, on the day of the invasion, June 22nd, 1941, the liberation of peoples from Bolshevik rule, and the recognition of two things: freedom of religion and freedom to work. Religion and labor. Under these rather vague proclamations, there did occur, at least initially, a rebirth of Ukrainian national life. And I mean initially during those very first months of German rule, when the Germans are still pushing the Soviets farther and farther east. Well, what form did that take? Numerous Ukrainian national activists, especially from now both factions of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, supporters of Bandera, supporters of Melnyk, both of them flocked to the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Their presence and cooperation with some local leaders resulted in a revival of Ukrainian cultural life and secular and religious life. So, for instance, over 100 non-communist newspapers suddenly began to appear. Cooperative societies, financial institutions that were set up. And on the political front, the Melnyk faction, the followers of Melnyk, the Melnyk faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, participated in the creation of a Ukrainian National Council set up in Kiev in October 1941. From their perspective, this council was intended to become a governing body for Ukraine. In fact, all of these developments from the summer and early fall of 1941 led Ukrainians to believe that the Germans had come as true liberators who would help them reestablish a non-Soviet national life. But the Nazi Germans, like the Soviets before them, were prisoners of their own ideology. And therefore, they had other plans for Ukraine. We know that during the interwar years, Nazi ideologists had evolved an elaborate theory to classify all peoples and therefore all civilizations throughout the world. The theory was based on racial distinctions, whereby certain master races, the so-called Herrenvolk, Herrenvölker, master races, and of course, the foremost representatives were the Germanic Aryans, allegedly with their blonde hair and blue eyes. Actually, most Germans weren't that. That may be Scandinavia farther north. And even there, they're mostly red-haired or pseudo-blonde, but they usually have blue eyes. These were the Germanic peoples, or the Germanic Aryans. And those superior peoples were to be served by inferior races, the so-called Untermenschen. Those below being human. Ethnic Ukrainians, like all Slavs, were considered among the inferior races. At best, they were useful only to serve the master races. Now, the lowest elements in this racial hierarchy were the Jews and the Roma, or Gypsies as they were known at the time. According to this Nazi racial theory, there was really only one people living on Ukrainian territory who could be considered superior, and those were the ethnic Germans that had lived throughout Ukrainian territory going back to the late 18th century. After the German army invaded the Soviet Union again, in June 1941, they set up these administrative entities such as the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Local Germans, those living in the right bank, those living down along the Black Sea, known since the 19th century as Black Sea Germans, and among those who weren't deported, because a lot of them were deported eastward when the Soviet army was leading. They didn't trust these Germans, but they didn't get all of them because... And so those who were not deported during this rapid Soviet evacuation were given a privileged position in the new Nazi order, new German order. Many of them served in the oppressive Nazi police regime, causing for the first time serious friction and hatred between these local Germans in Ukraine and the ethnic Ukrainians, as well as other Slavic peoples who had for decades been their neighbors. This German minority in Ukraine certainly had a favored position for a few years. On the other side of the Nazi racial spectrum were the Jews. During the German invasion of the Soviet Union, many Jews, especially in the eastern part of the Soviet Ukraine, succeeded in fleeing farther eastward as part of the Soviets' evacuation program of civilians, especially government employees, institutional functionaries, factory workers. Certainly in the first two cases, there were many Jews. But in western Ukrainian territories, that is Galicia, western Volhynia, Jews were actually prevented from fleeing eastward, either because the German troops were advancing so rapidly or by the refusal of Soviet security forces to let them cross that pre-1918, or the 1939 demarcation line, which more or less was like the borders of old Poland. And so those who remained behind, they now found themselves under German rule, and they now face the implications of the ultimate decision by the Nazis to implement what was known as the final solution, agreed upon in the spring of 1941. Well, to achieve this final solution, the Germans created special extermination task forces, which were known as Einsatzgruppen. Einsatzgruppen, task forces, special task forces. They were recruited from the SS and also from the German secret police, the Gestapo. These units, relatively small in size in relationship to the larger German army, they were assigned the task of following the German army and ridding the occupied territories of what, from the German perspective, was all undesirable elements. And that meant all communists, suspected or real, as well as Jews. The Jews were first rounded up in specific areas or specified areas known as ghettos. And then either they were shipped off in cattle cars to concentration camps and neighboring death camps in order to be gassed and burned. That was the favorite technique in Western Ukrainian lands. The other option was to round up Jewish inhabitants, herd them to the outskirts of the town or city, often near a pit, and shot dead. This was the favorite technique in central and eastern Ukraine. In other words, the Holocaust by bullets. The most infamous example of this second technique took place on September 29-30, 1941, where in the valley of a place called, a valley called Babyn Yar, just north of the center of Kiev, northwest of the center of Kiev, and only 1 week after the Germans had took control of the city, on September 29th and 30th, in just 2 days, 38,000 Jews were shot dead. With those murders, the remaining Jews in Ukraine's capital city were now liquidated. Those who hadn't fled eastward now were gone. Now, aside from the German-inspired bloodbath throughout Ukraine, it should be mentioned that the Romanians, who, as we saw, occupied Bessarabia and Transnistria, carried out similar policies, for instance, assisting the Germans in killing over 26,000 Jews in Odessa, which was part of Transnistria, now under Romanian rule, in late October 1941. Now, these German special units, the Einsatzgruppen, often strove to employ the locals, whether ethnic Ukrainians or Russians or Poles, certainly Germans, whatever elements possible in their murderous missions. Some of those locals cooperated, either willingly or under coercion. On the other hand, there were numerous efforts to thwart German policy and to save Jews. The most outstanding being led by that Metropolitan Sheptyts'kyi, whom we've heard about during this course, going back to the late 19th century, the head of the Greek Catholic Church in East Galicia, part of the Generalgouvernement, who condemned aiding the Germans in a pastoral letter read aloud in all Greek Catholic churches, and who himself, with his clergy, organized a network to hide Jews in monasteries. Nevertheless, in an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, brutal military occupation, the Germans were able to kill an estimated 850,000 to 900,000 Ukrainian Jews. This Holocaust, as it came to be known, whether carried out by gas asphyxiation or by bullets, eliminated a large portion of the Jewish population of Ukraine, and in many places wiped out the centuries-old Yiddish-based culture and Orthodox Hasidic religious culture that had thrived there. The Holocaust of World War II also had another detrimental effect. Even though the murderers were systematically organized, or the murders were systematically organized and carried out by German special units, which in the process killed thousands of ethnic Ukrainians as well, by the way, the result of that experience has been to create an even deeper hatred of Jews for Ukrainians, especially among some survivors of the Holocaust, and in particular their descendants in various countries of the world. Now, as for the ethnic Ukrainians living in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine during World War II, the seemingly promising developments for Ukrainian national life that had marked the first few months of German rule were brought to an abrupt end with the arrival of a man named Erich Koch. Erich Koch, he was the supreme leader, or known as the Gauleiter, to be the head of the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, already in November 1941. And so before the end of that year, many of those Ukrainian cultural societies were closed, several intellectuals were executed, the recently established National Council that was set up by the OUN Melnykite activists abolished, all of those activists arrested. We didn't even get to the end of 1941. These acts, not really surprising, since according to Nazi racial theory, Ukrainians were an inferior race. And as an inferior race, they did not need such organizations. They only needed to work for the master German race. By the way, this infamous line of Koch, I mean, it's impossible for any Ukrainian to be educated or sophisticated, right? I mean, they are inferior. Of course, it does happen. And Koch said, when I find a Ukrainian who is worthy of sitting at the same table with me, I must have him shot. Now, when such policies provoked the populace to resist, the Germans responded by applying the principle of collective responsibility and often annihilating entire villages, especially in the northern part of the country, in the area around Chernihiv up in the north, and certainly in Volhynia and Polisia, northwest of Kiev. As a result of this, the total number of non-Jews in Ukraine who were victims of Nazi extermination policies reached an estimated 3 million people. Beside the liquidation of humans, there were several other aspects of German policy which contributed further to alienation among inhabitants in those parts of the Soviet Union who may have initially welcomed Hitler's troops as liberators. And what were those policies of the Germans? Well, there were 3 of them, and they had to do with prisoners of war, collective farms, and forced labor. Prisoners of war, collective farms, forced labor. Well, remember this incredibly rapid German invasion of the Soviet Union? Well, the result of that was there was the arrest of an incredible number of prisoners of war, but they were just dumped outside and left to starve and die. In actual fact, between 1941 and 1944, 1,981,000 is the estimated number of deaths of prisoners of war, and another 1.3 million disappearances. That second German policy, collective farms. The Soviet-style collective farms actually continued to exist, although they were now given a different name, but food quotas still had to be fulfilled, forced requisitioning if necessary, and clearly that alienated the peasantry. And the third policy of the Germans, known as forced labor, or the so-called Ostarbeiter program. The Ostarbeiter program, which means Eastern workers. Ostarbeiter. Forced deportation between 1942 and 1945 of 2.8 million civilians to work in Germany. The Soviets just came, young, male, female, look good, take them off to the industrial heartland and also agricultural heartland of Germany. And that included Austria, by the way, because Austria had been an integral part of Germany. About, of the 2.8 million from Soviet lands in general, 2 million of them were ethnic Ukrainians. Now, considering all of these factors, it is not surprising that German policy provoked resistance. Resistance against their barbaric rule. And that resistance came in different forms. First, there were just simply spontaneous efforts at self-defense by elements of the population, neither nationalist nor Soviet, just protecting themselves. The second was a more organized, quite organized, nationalist and certainly anti-Soviet movement. And the third was the Soviet partisan movement. Now, the organized resistance, the organized nationalist, non-Soviet, was initiated in Volhynia and Policia, up here, because these are these areas of lowland marshes, forests, etc., very difficult area to control. It's the area more or less along the present Ukrainian-Belarusian border. And a guerrilla force led by a man named Taras Bulba, it was his military name, he's taken it from the title of the 19th century short novel by Nikolai Gogol. Taras Bulba already began to operate in the summer of 1941. It was first directed against the retreating Red Army, and then in March 1942, the unit redirected its attention against German forces, and it was then named already in March 1942 the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Known by its acronym, the UPA. It included OUN activists who had served in the German auxiliary police and guards. Also included, aside from ethnic Ukrainians, whomever else was in that part of the world and was struggling for their own liberation. So among the UPA, you could find Azeris or Uzbeks, Georgians, Tatars. These diverse units of the UPA came under the direction of a supreme command directed by the Banderite faction of the OUN. Throughout 1943, this UPA, total forces approaching 40,000 soldiers, fought against the German army as well as against the Soviet partisans. And initially, Volhynia up in the north became the center of activity, and then it moved southward to eastern Galicia. By the summer of 1944, the UPA could have numbered close to 100,000 troops. Now, another aspect of UPA activity was its relationship to the Poles. A lot of Poles still living in Volhynia and in Galicia. And that relationship concerned the civilian population, that is, Poles living in those scattered villages, and also the local armed Polish resistance movement, especially something called the Home Army. Now, the political tensions between ethnic Poles and Ukrainians, already in the interwar years, as we have seen, never went away. The Nazi German occupation and the military struggle connected with the war only made that situation worse. And this led to attacks by the UPA on Polish villages, reprisals by the Polish defense units and later the Polish Home Army on Ukrainian villages. The question of who started this cycle of violence and retribution remains a subject of often emotional debate among historians, also eyewitness survivors. But it is certain that several hundreds of thousands were driven from their homes, especially Poles from Galicia, from Volhynia, and that there was considerable loss of life on both sides. An estimated 50,000 Poles, up to 20,000 Ukrainians were killed, and those are the more reasonable estimates. Now, the third form of resistance to Nazi rule was the Soviet partisan movement. Took off really in 1943, in which there were about 43,000 Soviet partisans active in Ukraine. It was the Red Army, however, and not these various partisan movements that determined the future of Ukraine. The Soviet Union had already, by the end of 1941, reached a rapprochement with Great Britain and the United States. After all, they were an ally of the Soviet Union. But now that rapprochement resulted in an allied wartime alliance and the receipt, from the Soviet standpoint, of desperately needed military supplies, especially from the United States, because now they're allies. And armed with such material and a fierce determination to drive out the Nazi invader, the Soviets began an offensive in November 1942, which proved to be a decisive turning point in the war. The Red Army succeeded in cutting off the, up until then, seemingly invincible Germans at a place called Stalingrad on the lower Volga River. Way out here, you can see the end of the military zone at Stalingrad. After this incredibly costly battle finally ended in January, the end of January 1943. By the way, more Soviet lives were lost at Stalingrad alone than by the United States Army on all fronts throughout the entire war. From Stalingrad, the Red Army pushed westward so that most of 1943 was spent in driving the Germans from the left bank Ukraine. You can see the line starts here, then it's the left bank Ukraine, actually way out here, move it this way. Bitter fighting then continued on the right bank during the winter of 1944. The summer of 1944 witnessed the defeat and retreat of German forces from Western Volhynia, from Galicia, and finally in September and October 1944, the Red Army crosses the Carpathian Mountains into what was northeastern Hungary and Slovakia. And as a result of that, the Red Army now has access to the Danubian Basin, and the road to Budapest is open by the fall of 1944. This meant that most Ukrainian ethnographic territory for the first time, had come under Soviet control. And it's to that story of Soviet rule that we will now begin when we return. Thank you.